All right, India. When the British took over India, they faced some really awkward problems. Now, before the British took over, Islam had taken over much of India, particularly the northern part of India, what is today Bangladesh, Nepal, and Pakistan. But the Muslims had not been able to get very far south and penetrate deep into India. Then the British took over, and they conquered both Muslim-held territory and Hindu-held territory. But they faced some really awkward problems. One problem was the issue of child marriages. The people in India, a lot of times 9-year-old girls would get married to men who were in their 30s and 40s. Now, this, I mean, by our standards, it sounds fairly awful. But this was a custom they had, but what was in some ways equally as bad or worse was the practice of zanj. Practice of zanj was where, what's that? Z-A-N-J. I'm trying to find it here. I know I've had it. Anyway, basically the practice was that when the wife died, she was expected to light a big fire and then throw herself in the fire and destroy herself. She was not allowed to remarry, and you might say, what was the purpose of this? Well, the purpose was to keep her from becoming a burden to her family, because eventually she's going to get old and her mind is going to go bad, she's going to become unmanageable, and she's going to become set in her ways. So without a husband to keep her in line, she can just destroy herself. And the rest of the world told the British, you need to end this practice. I mean, after all, figure out for yourself. A 9-year-old girl marries a 38-year-old man. Guess which one of them is most likely to die first? And oftentimes these women will be in their 20s when their husbands died. I mean, in India, throughout much of its history, life was short and hard. And, you know, just, hey. Anyway, the British outlawed this practice. Sati, did I call it zanj? I'm sorry, the practice is sati, I see it now. It's up the top right side of 614, my apologies. Zanj is another practice that the Muslims used. Okay, I didn't feel comfortable. Anyway, the practice of sati, where the wife will throw herself on a fire and destroy herself when her husband dies. There was another practice of thuggee, from which we get the word thug, where that the people of India looked on it as being fashionable to allow persons to go around and steal from caravans. Well, the British made a law that anyone caught doing this could even be executed. They outlawed thugs, and they went after them, the thuggies. And again, they made some changes in India. There was another problem that the British had, and that was the problem of these lost castes. Now, if you know in India, they have a caste system. They have 5 main castes. And they had customs that nobody was allowed to marry outside their caste. But at the bottom of this caste system was a group of people called the outcast. And the outcasts were treated with very, very little respect. Actually, you might say no respect. And looked down on the British, tried to tell the people of India, hey, this practice is detestable to us. You need to upgrade your outcast. The process of doing this was very, very slow and continues to this day. Now, I want to say, if you talk to a person in India today, they'll say, oh, we don't treat our outcasts badly anymore. In fact, we now allow marriages between our caste. He's telling partly the truth. On paper, he's right. But in actual reality, there was a case where that a father killed his daughter because she married someone outside the caste. Actually, she dated a man outside her caste. This crime occurred, folks, listen carefully, not in India. This crime occurred right here in the United States. It happened several years ago. They took it to court. The person said, this is my religion. I thought I was allowed to practice it here. And the judge said, no, in this country, this is outlawed. This is illegal. And the judge sent him to jail for a good many years for the crime of murder. This business of religious freedom hot issue in our country right now, by the way. Super hot. And I can't dare tell you which way it's going to go. But in other words, these practices the British tried to deal with. Another practice was the people of India would take their sick and just throw them in a sick home and not care for them, expect them to die. And very few persons who were put in a sick home came out alive. Now we have hospices, but the difference is in our hospice we try to care for them. And some people walk out of a hospice very much alive and live a good many years. Well, jumping ahead, Mother Teresa went to India and tried to convince the Indian people, hey, you need to care for your sick, care for your downtrodden. And eventually these ideas caught hold. But the British, again, if the British tried to tolerate these customs, they meet with the disapproval of much of the Christian world, or Christian Europe and North America, or Latin America. And if they tried to stop them, they meet with the disapproval of Indians. And these were really, really awkward problems that the Indian people had to deal with. Now, Lockheed made it a policy to hire people from abroad because they'd say, hey, you know, if they'd reason, if we could tell them we have so many of your people working for our factory, they'd be more likely to buy our airplanes. So one of the men they hired was the son of a Pakistani nobleman, a Muslim man, but his father was a Pakistani nobleman. His older brother inherited the title of nobility. This man was the second son, so he did not become a nobleman. But he got a job as a Lockheed engineer, and he and I had a talk one time. We had several talks. But he said that the British would send their worst of officials over to Britain. Now this is something you used to go in, but this was his opinion. And they were just simply, they created a whole lot of resentment because they would tell the people of India and Pakistan the way you're doing things is wrong, you need to do things our way. And the result was a whole lot of confusion and a whole lot of brutality as the British tried to suppress the ways of the people. Another problem they had, the British would bring in their textiles, which was high quality cloth that had been woven by the machinery I talked about earlier, the machinery of the Industrial Revolution. The women of India were still spinning yarn with spinning wheels. Well, the British came in with their fine clothes, and it was better quality than what the Indian women could spin, with a result that a lot of Indian women were thrown out of work. Because after all, you can use machines to make clothing a lot cheaper than you can make clothing using the old-fashioned spinning wheel method. Hey, 150, 200 years ago in our own country, if a person had 2 pairs of breeches, he was considered fairly wealthy. Actually, you might have 2 pairs, one pair for dress-up occasions, and another pair to run around the house. If you had that many, you were considered okay. If you had 3 pairs of breeches, you were fairly rich. Again, because clothing costs so much money. But then along came the Industrial Revolution with its cheaper, better quality clothing. But it put a lot of Indian women out of work. The people of India felt like they were inferior. It had a big negative psychological effect. And eventually led to rebellion, which we'll talk about later. It led to rebellion under the leadership of Gandhi. But again, that's a subject for a later chapter. Again, I did mention this in this class. One of the reasons the British conquered India was they lost 13 colonies in North America. So they went to India to try to get back some of their wealth and use India the same way they had tried to use the 13 colonies that later became the United States. All right, Southeast Asia. At first, the Spanish had the Philippines. Initially, like I say, initially Spain. Initially Spain and the Dutch, or Holland, had the East Indies. What is today Indonesia? I'll call them the East Indies. That's what they were known about. Again, today known as Indonesia. This was the beginning of European intrusion into that part of the world. And eventually other nations moved in. Your book shows a map on page 616 of the other nations that moved in, particularly the Portuguese, the Spanish and Americans. The Philippines were first Spanish, then American. The British got what is today Myanmar, or it was called Burma at the time, and part of the Malay Peninsula. The French got what's used to, on the old maps, you'll see it as French Indochina. I say the old maps because these maps were still in use when I was a kid. I mean, when I first started looking at maps in the 1950s, a lot of the maps were old maps even from the 1940s to 1930s. And they would call this area French Indochina. Today it consists of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The French conquered it and held it until the 1950s. Thailand was never conquered, and one of the reasons was the Thai king became westernized. I'm not going to say for sure he became a Christian, but he became somewhat westernized. There was a movie called The King and I. Did any of you happen to, it came out many, many years ago, in which it showed the Thai king. But he was, because of his Western ways, he was able to convince Western powers to not conquer him, not conquer his country. So Thailand remained independent. Not so much of Vietnam and Laos, Cambodia, Burma, Indonesia, Philippines. They were conquered. Now your book mentions two kings, the father and son, who attempted to introduce Western learning in Thailand and maintain some kind of normal relations with European powers, which was difficult, but he managed. The United States was interested in the Philippines because right across from the Philippines, across the seas little ways, was the big country of China, which seemed to hold a whole lot of trading opportunities. Now we're going to talk about China in more detail in the next chapter. But China had its millions of people, and of course, to get from the United States to China, you have to cross 10,000 miles of ocean. And they needed refueling stations. So hence the United States set its sights on Hawaii. And again, if you look on the map, it's not hard to see why. Hawaii is right in the middle of the ocean. It made for a convenient place to stock up on fuel, refuel, and stock up on supplies, food and fresh water and other supplies. So the United States had its eyes on Hawaii and on the Philippines. In 1898, the United States took the Philippines from Spain, then had to fight another war against the Filipino guerrillas. And I want to say this about the war against the guerrillas. I've mentioned already it was a very brutal war. I don't recall ever having studied it in the history books in my time. Very brutal, and again, I didn't know it was fought until about 8 or 10 years ago after I started teaching here. I learned that we had fought an extremely brutal war against the Filipinos and had suppressed them with as brutal means as we found necessary. Folks, I'm not saying it was right. It's just, I mean, it's an unfortunate fact of history. But once we had Hawaii and the Philippines, we then had a stepping stone into China. All right. The book then talks about the nature of colonial rule, how the colonials oftentimes resented European powers, how the European powers, well, one of the things that European powers wanted from these colonies was the raw materials. And this is particularly true when we talk about Africa. Africa, folk, is the most mineral wealthy continent on the face of the globe. with lots of iron and tin and gold and diamonds and ivory and I don't know what all else, but the most mineral wealthy place on earth. And Europeans coveted the wealth of Africa and felt like they had a right to just go in and take it. So one of the reasons that Europeans justified their taking over was for economic benefit of the mother country, for trade. And oh yes, about this time, a man named Rudyard Kipling, I recall, I'll say on a personal note, I had a difficult time learning that name. I'm not going to write it before, but he wrote a famous tract called, actually it was a poem called The White Man's Burden. He said, we white people must take up the white man's burden. The white man's burden was simply that we must civilize, Christianize, democratize these people, and we must make these people, elevate them to our level of living, bring them out of their poverty, bring them out of their superstition, bring them out. Do you have a comment?
Isn't that like the white man's burden kind of like, well, I mean, like what you said, but also kind of like saying that the white race is superior than anyone else and that they should.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I just assumed you would pick that up. Yeah, indeed, indeed. It was saying that the white man was in fact superior. I have to make a disclaimer here. No, I don't want to in any way imply that I believe any of that, but I must teach you about it because it explains why they acted how they did. Of course, this is in your book too, but it's basically the idea that the white man was superior and his civilization was superior. Therefore, it was the duty of the burden of the white man to go out to these lesser peoples and make them, bring them up to our level of civilization. Civilization, Christianization. Actually, this book talks, and we'll talk later about 3 C's. Since I mentioned them, I'll mention them now. And this I do want you to learn. Commerce, civilization, and Christianity. In other words, the white man had the duty. So Rudyard Kipling said, let's take up the white man's burden and bring these people up to our level.